When a prejudiced cop makes what he believes to be a routine arrest, driven by the biases he refuses to acknowledge, he never anticipates that the balance of power will shift so dramatically. But what happens when the person he attempts to humiliate in the street stands before him in the courtroom? Not as a victim, but as a formidable force of justice? How will this moment of reckoning shatter his assumptions, forcing him to confront the truth about himself and the system he serves? Before we delve into this gripping tale of justice, redemption, and the dismantling of unchecked power, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. You think that because you drive an expensive car, you're untouchable? Officer Ben Carter's voice was sharp, laced with a condescension that barely masked his irritation. His words sliced through the cool night air like a blade. But the woman before him, Elise Bryant, remained composed. Her fingers rested lightly on the steering wheel, her expression giving away nothing. She watched him carefully, her gaze unwavering as he stood there, shoulders squared, the smirk of authority curving at the corner of his lips, tinged with something darker. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone clipped, his patience non-existent. She didn't react. Not with panic, not with pleading, and certainly not with fear. "Officer," Elise said smoothly, her voice steady, calm, too calm for Ben's liking. Most people, especially people like her, knew better than to test him. There was always a tremor in their voice, a silent plea in their eyes, an unspoken surrender that made his job easier. But not her. She sat there, measured and unreadable, a quiet defiance in the way she carried herself. Ben's grip tightened on her documents, flipping through them as if searching for an imperfection, a mistake, something, anything that would validate the narrative he had already constructed in his mind. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elise asked, her voice unwavering. Ben's jaw clenched. He hated the way she spoke, the way she held herself like she belonged here, like she had every right to question him. She wasn't scared, and that didn't sit right with him. "You're driving a car worth more than most people's houses," he said, folding his arms, his stare hard and unrelenting. "That's problem enough." Elise remained still, composed. She didn't rush to explain herself, didn't stammer out an apology, or offer a justification for daring to exist in a space he believed wasn't meant for her. She simply watched him, measured, unshaken. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Still, she didn't move. She met his gaze with an unflinching certainty, her confidence as sharp as a blade. "May I ask why?" she inquired, her tone polite but firm. "I've complied with your requests. My license is valid. The car is legally registered in my name. What exactly am I being detained for?" Ben felt a heat rise in his chest, the tightness of frustration, the growing sting of humiliation. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. There was something about her tailored outfit, the way she carried herself, the way she refused to shrink beneath his authority, that got under his skin. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he snapped, his patience thinning. But still, she did not cower. She did not fold. "Am I under arrest?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, the question crisp and deliberate. There was no aggression in her tone, but there was no submission either. It was precise, controlled, as if she knew exactly what she was doing and exactly how much it unnerved him. Ben's jaw locked. His pride ached beneath the weight of her defiance. "Yes," he spat, more out of frustration than logic. "Yes, you are." And before she could utter another word, before she could call attention to the crack in his authority, he reached for the door handle and yanked it open. Elise stepped out, slow and deliberate, her movements careful but unafraid. When she rose to her full height, standing tall in her heels, she was eye level with him, level in a way that made his stomach twist. She flicked a glance toward the dash cam of his patrol car before shifting her gaze back to him, her eyes unreadable, yet filled with something unmistakable. "This," she said softly, her voice a quiet promise, "is a mistake." Ben ignored the weight of her words, ignored the way something deep inside him tightened at their meaning. "Turn around," he barked, pulling out his handcuffs. "Hands behind your back." And yet, even as he reached for her wrists, even as the cold steel clamped around them, the uneasy truth pressed at the edges of his mind. He wasn't the one in control. Not anymore. Ben's fingers twitched, that familiar surge of control thrumming beneath his skin as the handcuffs locked into place. There it was, that quiet, satisfying click of power. Yet, Elise remained unfazed. She moved with an effortless grace, her posture unbroken, her expression unreadable. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" she murmured, her voice smooth and deliberate as he led her toward the patrol car. Ben scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Does it matter?" he shot back, shoving the door open before pushing her inside with more force than necessary. The moment he slammed the door shut, he exhaled sharply, leaning against the car, trying to shake off the strange unease creeping into his chest. This shouldn't bother him. It was routine, just another arrest. But her words clung to him like an echo he couldn't silence. The station smelled of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh, sterile glow. Elise sat in the holding cell, hands resting neatly in her lap, her posture composed. If the cuffs had rattled her, she didn't show it. Ben stood across the room, watching her through the glass, irritation gnawing at his gut. He had expected frustration, maybe some quiet tears, the kind of silent defeat that usually settled in after an arrest. But she wasn't crumbling. She wasn't even cracking. She looked as if she were merely waiting for a delayed flight, like this was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. His fingers drummed against his belt as he turned away, jaw tight. "Who the hell is she?" he muttered under his breath. He stalked back to his desk, flipping open her file, searching for something, anything, that made sense of the gnawing doubt creeping up his spine. Elise Bryant. No criminal record, a pristine driving history, no unpaid tickets, no warrants. And then his eyes landed on the address. A home in one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city. His frown deepened. "Ben," he turned to see his partner, Officer Ramirez, approaching with an uneasy expression. "You sure about this one?" Ramirez asked, lowering his voice. "I ran her plates. Everything checks out. She's clean. This might not look great." Ben bristled. "She was being uncooperative," he said defensively. Ramirez lifted an eyebrow, glancing toward the holding cell where Elise sat, still composed, still calm. "Uncooperative, huh?" His tone was dry. "She looks like she's about to announce her campaign for office. Maybe let her lawyer deal with it before this turns into something bigger than you can handle." Ben waved him off, but the uneasy feeling only grew. The next morning, Ben walked into the courthouse, his confidence intact. He had followed procedure. He had done his job. Elise Bryant would plead guilty, pay her fine, and this entire incident would dissolve into the past. Routine. Simple. Done. But the moment he stepped through the heavy double doors, he knew something was wrong. The air was thick with hushed whispers. People stole glances at him, murmuring under their breath, shifting in their seats as if something weighty hung in the air. His stomach twisted. At the front of the courtroom, Elise stood, not in the casual clothes from the night before, but in a sharp navy suit, her posture commanding, her presence undeniable. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, deliberate style, every inch of her radiating control. She wasn't just standing there. She owned the space. Ben slowed his steps, his pulse thudding in his ears. What the hell was happening? "Your Honor," Elise's voice rang through the courtroom, clear, precise, unshaken. "Before we proceed, I would like to state for the record that I am a federal prosecutor, and I will be representing myself in this matter." The room fell silent. Ben's breath hitched. The judge blinked, clearly taken aback. "Mrs. Bryant, this is highly irregular." Elise smiled faintly, controlled, measured. "Yes, Your Honor, but given the circumstances of my arrest, I believe it is necessary to personally address the allegations and the actions of the arresting officer." The blood drained from Ben's face. His hands curled into fists at his sides as reality crashed over him like a wave. This wasn't just another arrest. This wasn't just another routine stop. This was a reckoning. Elise turned slightly, her gaze locking onto his from across the room for the first time since the night before. And in that moment, Ben knew. He wasn't the one in control anymore. Ben saw something shift in Elise's eyes, a flicker of something sharp, something cold. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was something far more unnerving purpose. "You've made a grave mistake, Officer Carter," she said, her voice unwavering, carrying the weight of quiet certainty. "And today, we're going to talk about it." The room fell into a heavy silence. Every eye turned toward him, the weight of her words settling over him like a gathering storm. Elise Bryant stood tall, her presence unshakable, her voice commanding the courtroom as if she had been born to stand in this very place. "Your Honor," she continued, her gaze never leaving the judge, "I do not stand here simply to assert my innocence. I stand here to expose a pattern of abuse within law enforcement, one that Officer Carter's actions exemplify. I request that this case receive the full gravity it deserves." A ripple of murmurs spread through the packed courtroom. Officer Ben Carter sat frozen at the defendant's table, the usual confidence that had carried him through years on the force suddenly cracking like thin ice beneath him. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing in on him, suffocating. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. People like Elise Bryant, composed, professional, powerful, didn't belong in holding cells. And they certainly weren't supposed to be standing in front of a judge, dismantling him piece by piece before a captivated audience. The judge studied her carefully before nodding. "Mrs. Bryant, I will allow you to proceed," she said, her voice measured, curiosity and caution woven together. "But I expect your arguments to remain relevant to the charges at hand." Elise nodded, turning slightly toward the gallery. The room was packed. Journalists, activists, community members who had caught wind of the case and gathered like spectators to a reckoning. Their eyes burned into Ben, their judgment suffocating. Elise moved with the kind of poised certainty that could only come from someone who had lived in courtrooms for years. She began her argument with precision, her words a blade cutting through the silence. "I was stopped without cause," she said, her voice even, deliberate. "No valid reason was given. Despite my full compliance, despite presenting my valid license and registration, I was still accused of resisting authority." She let the statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "A charge often used as a catch-all when no real crime has been committed." Her eyes flicked toward Ben just for a second, but long enough that he felt it. A direct hit, a silent challenge. "This isn't an isolated incident," she continued. "This is a systemic issue." Ben shifted in his seat. He could feel the eyes of the room boring into him. The pressure was suffocating. He wanted to speak, to push back, to say something, anything, but his attorney had warned him to stay silent. Any word out of turn would only make things worse. Elise took a slow step toward the jury box, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step measured and deliberate. "Your Honor, I have spent years prosecuting cases just like this one. I have seen firsthand how power is abused, and I have fought against it," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "But yesterday I was not the prosecutor. I was the victim." She let that truth settle in the air before delivering the final blow. "And today I stand here, not just for myself, but for every person who has been subjected to unwarranted profiling and mistreatment." Her words were a hammer, driving deep, each syllable landing with weight. For the first time, Ben felt something other than anger, other than frustration. It curled in his stomach, uncomfortable, foreign, something dangerously close to shame. And then Elise presented her evidence. There was no grand theatrics, no dramatic pauses, just a quiet ruthlessness in the way she laid out the facts, methodical and damning. Witnesses were called. People who had sat in that very courtroom before, watching as Ben's actions went unquestioned, unchecked. One by one, they took the stand. A young black man in his 20s stepped forward, his face composed, but his voice edged with something raw. "Officer Carter pulled me over last year," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the memory. "He said my taillight was out." He swallowed, shaking his head. "It wasn't." The room remained still. Ben felt the walls closing in. Then he searched my car without asking. When I questioned him, he said, "People like you are always hiding something." The words hung in the air like smoke, lingering long after they had been spoken. Ben's jaw clenched, his fists curled beneath the table. He wanted to defend himself, to argue, to justify, but there was no outlet, no words that wouldn't make everything worse. His attorney leaned in, whispering low and firm, "Keep your head down. It's better this way." Ben swallowed hard. During recess, he sat alone in a corner of the hallway, his head in his hands, his entire body heavy with the weight of everything crashing down around him. Footsteps approached. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Ramirez sat down beside him, his presence hesitant, almost careful. Ben exhaled, voice low, barely more than a whisper. "How bad is it looking?" Ramirez hesitated, running a hand over his face before finally responding. "It's not good, man." Ramirez's voice was low but firm, his expression unreadable. "She's tearing you apart in there, Ben." Ben closed his eyes for a second, willing himself to breathe. Ramirez continued, his tone edged with something close to pity. "She's got everything. Reports, witness statements, body cam footage, every single detail stacked against you." Ben exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. His pulse pounded in his ears. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt empty, hollow. Ramirez didn't look away. He studied Ben for a long moment, his jaw tightening before he finally spoke. "Didn't you, though?" Ben's eyes snapped up to meet his. "I've backed you up more times than I can count," Ramirez said, voice measured, controlled. "But maybe it's time to take a step back and ask yourself why this keeps happening." Ben swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" Ramirez sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before leaning in. His next words were quiet, but they cut deeper than any accusation ever had. "I'm saying maybe this isn't just about Elise Bryant. Maybe it's about the way you see people like her." Ben felt something twist deep in his gut. "You didn't see her as a person when you pulled her over, did you?" Ramirez pressed. "You saw something else." Ben didn't answer. He couldn't, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Back in the courtroom, Elise methodically dismantled his defense, her voice steady, unwavering. She wielded the truth like a weapon, sharp and unrelenting. And then she delivered the final, crushing blow. She played the footage. The grainy dash cam recording filled the courtroom, a silent witness to everything that had transpired. There it was, Elise, calm and composed, responding with nothing but professionalism. And then there was him, his words, his tone, the way his authority bled into something uglier, something he could no longer justify. The contrast was undeniable, stark. Ben could feel the shift in the room, the realization settling over every person watching. And then Elise turned to the court, her voice cutting through the thick, suffocating silence. "This case isn't just about me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the gallery. "It's about the culture that allows officers to act with impunity, especially toward people of color." She let the words settle, heavy and deliberate. "Officer Carter isn't an anomaly," she continued. "He is a symptom of a larger problem, and if we don't address it, we are complicit in allowing it to continue." Ben swallowed hard, but it did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure if she was wrong. The weight of the room pressed down on him, suffocating. Judgment hung thick in the air, not just from the jury, not just from the crowd, but from something deeper, his own conscience. He had told himself for years that he was one of the good ones, that his instincts were always right, that his gut feelings were justified. His own conscience. He had told himself for years that he was one of the good ones, that his instincts were always right, that his gut feelings were justified. But now, watching the footage, hearing her words, he saw himself in a way he never had before. And he didn't like what he saw. He thought about all the times he had stopped someone because something about them felt off. The way he had sized people up before they had even spoken. The way he had let his own biases, subtle, unspoken, but undeniable, shape his decisions. Had he ever really seen Elise Bryant as a person when he pulled her over? Or had he just seen what he wanted to see? The judge called for closing statements. Elise rose to her feet, her presence commanding, her voice steady. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just a quiet, unshakable resolve. "I do not stand here today to seek vengeance," she said, her eyes scanning the room, meeting every gaze without hesitation. "I stand here to demand accountability," her voice carried, clear and unwavering, "to demand that we do better, not just as individuals, but as a society." Ben barely breathed as she continued, every word a hammer against the walls he had spent years building around his own conscience. "Officer Carter's actions weren't just about me," Elise said. "They were about every person who has ever been made to feel less than. Every person who has ever been stopped, questioned, or treated unfairly simply because of the color of their skin." She paused, letting the silence stretch, the weight of her words sinking into the bones of the courtroom. "We have to be better than this." Applause erupted, breaking the tension like a dam bursting. It wasn't wild or unruly, but measured, resolute. Ben sat motionless, staring down at his hands. His mind raced, but for once he had no words. Because deep down, beneath all the justifications, all the defensiveness, he already knew. The scales had tipped. The judge called for a brief recess. Ben remained seated, his body heavy, his pulse slow and deliberate. Across the room, Elise stood near the prosecution table, her back straight, her expression unreadable. But there was something in the way she carried herself, something that told him she had never just been fighting for herself. She had been fighting for something much bigger. And for the first time, Ben couldn't shake the gnawing realization. Maybe she was right. The courtroom had quieted. The energy had shifted. It was no longer electric, no longer crackling with tension. It had settled into something heavier. Anticipation. Judge Morrison returned to the bench, her face unreadable as she shuffled through the stack of evidence and testimony before her. She cleared her throat, and then in the stillness of the room she began to speak. Judge Morrison's voice, calm yet unyielding, cut through the silence like a blade. "It is evident that this case extends far beyond a single traffic stop," she stated, her tone measured but firm. "What we have witnessed here is a reflection of a larger systemic issue, one that cannot be ignored any longer." Ben Carter felt his chest tighten, a cold weight settling in his stomach as she continued. "This court will refer your actions to the Department's Internal Affairs for a full investigation," she announced, her verdict ringing out like the final strike of a gavel, absolute and inescapable. "Additionally, I am recommending mandatory bias training, not just for you, Officer Carter, but for your entire precinct." The murmurs that spread through the gallery were swift and sharp, rippling outward like an aftershock. Ben sat motionless, his face pale and unreadable. But inside, something fractured. The weight of it all, his choices, his failures, the undeniable truth, pressed down on him with suffocating force. The judge turned then, her expression softening only slightly as she addressed Elise Bryant. "For Miss Bryant," she said, her voice carrying a quiet reverence, "I want to commend you for your courage and professionalism in bringing these deeply important issues to light. You have handled this matter with extraordinary grace, and I can only hope that your efforts serve as a catalyst for meaningful and lasting change." Elise nodded, her expression calm but resolute. The court adjourned, but the impact of those final words lingered, heavy and undeniable. Outside the courtroom, the air buzzed with tension, relief, and something else, an urgency that had yet to settle. The courthouse lobby was alive with voices, reporters crowding around Elise, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her, eager to capture her words. She stood poised, composed, the embodiment of unwavering conviction. "This was never just about me," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the chaos. "This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that the systems meant to serve and protect do so equally, without bias, without injustice. I am grateful the court took this matter seriously." But this is only the beginning. Ben watched from a distance, his pulse a dull, relentless drumbeat in his ears. Ramirez stood beside him, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Elise. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "You've got a long road ahead, Ben. Ben swallowed hard, his throat dry. You can't keep running from this. Ben exhaled, his jaw tightening. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But something in him shifted. And so for the first time, instead of walking away, he walked toward Elise. She saw him coming before he reached her eyes narrowing slightly, her guard rising. Elise, he said, hesitating, his voice quieter than he intended. Can I have a word? The reporter stirred, sensing something, but Elise held up a hand, signaling them to wait. She studied him for a beat, then nodded, stepping a few feet away from the crowd. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. What is it, Officer Carter? Her voice was clipped but professional. Ben shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how small his words felt compared to the damage they were meant to acknowledge. He faltered, the right words escaping him. He took a breath, forcing himself to meet her gaze. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Elise tilted her head slightly, skepticism flickering across her face. Sorry for what? His face burned. For everything, he admitted, voice raw. For how I treated you. For the assumptions I made. He swallowed, the lump in his throat thick and unrelenting. For being part of the problem. She didn't react right away. Instead, she studied him, her arms crossed over her chest, her silence stretching between them like a test. Then finally she spoke. Do you even understand what you're apologizing for, Ben? Her voice was steady but laced with something sharp. Or are you just trying to save face? The words hit harder than he expected, but he didn't flinch. I'm starting to, he admitted, his voice quiet. I know I have a lot to learn. A lot to unlearn, actually. The weight of his confession hung between them. Elise exhaled, her posture softening just a fraction. Apologies are a start, Officer Carter, she said finally, but they don't mean much without action. Change isn't about saying the right words. It's about proving them. Ben nodded. I will. She studied him for another moment before nodding, then turned and walked away. And as he stood there, watching her disappear into the crowd, he felt the weight of her words settle deep into his bones. Weeks later, Ben sat in a small community center downtown, surrounded by faces he once would have never thought to engage with. The chairs were arranged in a circle, the atmosphere open but tense, filled with the quiet hum of unspoken truths. The facilitator, a young black woman named Maya, offered a warm but measured smile as she addressed the group. Welcome to the first session of our anti-bias training, she said. This is a space for reflection, growth, and accountability. Let's begin by introducing ourselves and why we're here. Ben's turn came quickly. He could feel the weight of the room on him, waiting. He cleared his throat. I'm Ben Carter, he said. I'm a police officer, and I'm here because I've made a lot of mistakes. I've hurt people, and I need to figure out how to fix that. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Maya nodded. Thank you for your honesty, Ben. Acknowledging the problem is the first step. Meanwhile, Elise poured herself into the work. Her story had ignited something, her voice carrying far beyond the courtroom. Public forums, national interviews, community meetings. She became a beacon for change, advocating not just for reform, but for accountability, for justice that was more than just a word on paper. One evening, exhausted from a long meeting with an advocacy group, Elise returned to her office and found a letter waiting in her mailbox. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, deliberate. She hesitated before opening it. Elise, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that your words didn't fall on deaf ears. I've started attending anti-bias training. I'm working with community leaders to understand the harm I've caused. I know it's not enough, but I'm trying. Thank you for holding me accountable. You didn't have to, but you did, and it made me see things I should have seen a long time ago. Ben Carter. Elise folded the letter carefully, setting it in her desk drawer. She didn't know exactly how she felt, relieved maybe, cautiously hopeful, because change didn't happen overnight, and one man's journey was just a small part of a much bigger fight. Months turned into a year. The police department implemented new training protocols. A civilian oversight committee was formed to address misconduct. The progress was slow, frustrating at times, but it was happening. One evening, Elise stood on the courthouse steps, the city skyline glowing behind her. She scrolled through an email from a local advocacy group, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. Across the city, Ben stood before a newly painted mural on the side of the precinct, a vibrant depiction of justice, unity, and hope. He traced the colors with his eyes, feeling something unfamiliar but undeniable. Purpose. He wasn't the same man who had sat in that courtroom months ago, and he didn't know if he'd ever fully make amends, but he would spend the rest of his life trying. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elise and Ben, once adversaries, reflected on the paths that had led them here. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and they were still walking it.